Martin Kells and Eleanor Briggs, two ordinary names from a quiet English town, bound forever by a murder that shocked a nation, destroyed an innocent life, and ignited a legal revolution that changed the course of justice across 2 continents. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. The town of Lancashire sat quietly between rolling green hills and a winding river that sparkled under the morning sun. Life there was predictable. Everyone knew everyone else, and the loudest sound most days came from the church bells or the chatter of children walking to school. But everything changed on a damp November morning in 1979, when a jogger named Harold Pritchard stumbled upon something that would destroy the town's peace forever. As he crossed the old railway bridge, he noticed what looked like a pile of clothes near the base of the slope. When he got closer, he realized it was the body of a young woman. She was lying face down in the mud, her long hair tangled and soaked from the previous night's rain. Her wrists were bound tightly with thin cord, and a deep bruise marked the side of her neck. The air felt heavy and still, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Harold ran to the nearest house to call the police, his hands trembling so much that he could barely dial the number. When the officers arrived, the scene shocked even the most experienced among them. The woman was soon identified as Eleanor Briggs, a 28-year-old schoolteacher known for her kindness and patience with her students. She lived alone in a small cottage near the school and had no known enemies. Her last known whereabouts were the night before, when she was seen leaving a charity event at the town hall. She never made it home. A single silver button lay just a few inches from her body, half buried in the mud. It didn't match any of her clothes. The detectives marked it carefully, unsure whether it was an important clue or just a coincidence. The investigation started quickly, but the clues were few. There were no footprints clear enough to follow, and the rain had washed away most traces of evidence. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared: Eleanor had been strangled. There were no signs of robbery, no forced assault, and nothing missing from her bag. Whoever killed her had done it deliberately and left quietly, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. The news spread through Lancashire within hours, and fear settled over the town like a thick cloud. Parents began locking their doors, and people who once left their windows open at night now sealed them shut. Detectives interviewed everyone who had attended the charity event, but no one remembered seeing anything suspicious. A few people mentioned a faint argument outside the hall, but no one could describe who was involved. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure on the police mounted. Reporters from London began arriving, turning the quiet village into a swarm of flashing cameras and questions. They called it the Lancashire Mystery, printing Eleanor's photograph on every front page. The community demanded answers, but the investigators were stuck. Behind the scenes, rumors began to swirl. Some said Eleanor had been followed by a jealous admirer. Others whispered that it was the work of a stranger passing through town. But one detective noticed something peculiar in Eleanor's school records. She had recently reported missing funds from a local charity account. It was small, barely a few £100s, but it opened a new line of inquiry. Could the murder have been connected to something financial rather than personal? The thought unsettled everyone. The more the police searched, the more confused the case became. The only physical clue, that lone silver button, remained unexplained. It was simple, round, and engraved with a faint letter. For now, it sat in an evidence bag on the detective's desk, waiting for its meaning to be revealed. And while the townspeople tried to move on, none of them knew that the quiet death of Eleanor Briggs would one day reach far beyond their village, rippling through 2 nations and changing the very laws meant to protect them. The investigation into Eleanor Briggs's death took a new direction when a name began to surface repeatedly during police interviews: Martin Kells. He was a reserved librarian who had worked at the Lancashire Public Library for over a decade. Most of the townspeople knew him as polite, punctual, and always neatly dressed. He lived alone in a modest flat above a bakery, spent his evenings cataloging old books, and occasionally volunteered at the local school where Eleanor taught. He had helped her several times with her lesson plans, often staying after hours to find material for her students. Their professional friendship seemed harmless, but in the eyes of the desperate investigators, it quickly became something more. Detectives visited Martin at his home just a few days after Eleanor's funeral. They found him calm, though visibly shaken by the news of her death. He admitted he had seen Eleanor at the charity event that night, but said they had only spoken briefly. According to him, she left early, and he went home soon after. It seemed like a simple statement, yet there was one problem. No one else could confirm his whereabouts for the rest of the evening. The police began to dig deeper into his life, searching for anything that might connect him to the murder scene. When they discovered that a torn piece of fabric found near the railway bridge matched the color of his tweed jacket, the investigation took a sharp turn. The press wasted no time in turning Martin into a villain. Headlines screamed about the bookish killer, painting him as a man who hid a dark obsession behind his calm demeanor. Reporters followed him everywhere, shouting questions, photographing his every move. In the town square, people whispered that he had been infatuated with Eleanor and that she had rejected him. None of it was proven, but the rumors spread faster than any truth could. For the investigators, the pressure to close the case was growing unbearable. The community demanded justice, and Martin was an easy target, quiet, strange, and now tied to the crime scene by a scrap of cloth. When the police searched his home, they found several of Eleanor's old lesson notes and a copy of a book she had borrowed from the library months earlier. Though perfectly innocent on its own, the items were used to suggest that Martin had been collecting her belongings. It was enough to secure an arrest warrant. The moment he was led out of his building in handcuffs, the cameras flashed like lightning. The image of his pale face and trembling hands was printed across every newspaper in the country. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, the police declared the case solved. To them, the torn cloth and the supposed argument between Martin and Eleanor about school funds were reason enough to prosecute. The public, still grieving and fearful, embraced the story eagerly. They wanted closure, and Martin Kells became the perfect villain to deliver it. In private, a few officers expressed doubt. The crime scene had never been properly secured, and several items had gone missing before being logged into evidence. But those concerns were quietly dismissed. After all, the case had a suspect, a motive, and enough headlines to satisfy the public's hunger for answers. As Martin sat in his cell awaiting trial, he became the most hated man in Lancashire. Outside the police station, people gathered with candles and signs calling for a life sentence. They believed the danger had been captured, but behind those stone walls, Martin Kells maintained his silence, convinced that the truth would eventually come out. What no one yet realized was that this arrest, celebrated as a triumph of justice, was in fact the beginning of a much deeper tragedy, one that would haunt the country for decades to come. The trial of Martin Kells began in the spring of 1980, drawing national attention to the quiet town of Lancashire. For weeks, every newspaper headline and radio broadcast revolved around the case. People lined up outside the courthouse long before dawn, hoping to secure a seat inside. The courtroom was filled with the hum of whispers, the click of reporters' cameras, and the heavy anticipation of a verdict that everyone thought they already knew. Martin was brought in each morning under heavy guard, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights, his hands shaking slightly as he sat beside his defense lawyer. The air felt thick with judgment before the proceedings even began. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of obsession and jealousy. They claimed Martin had become infatuated with Eleanor Briggs, that she had tried to distance herself from him, and that rejection had driven him to murder. They relied heavily on circumstantial evidence: the torn piece of his tweed jacket found near the railway bridge, the notes and personal items belonging to Eleanor discovered in his apartment, and the rumor of an argument between them over school funds. Each piece was presented as if it formed part of a clear puzzle, though none of it truly proved guilt. The prosecutor's voice rose dramatically as he described how Martin supposedly followed Eleanor that night, confronted her by the railway bridge, and strangled her in a fit of rage. The defense, led by a young barrister named Christopher Vane, tried to dismantle the story piece by piece. He reminded the jury that there were no fingerprints linking Martin to the scene, no witness who saw him there, and no physical evidence proving his involvement. The fabric, he argued, could have been placed there by anyone. The missing charity funds were never tied directly to him, and owning items related to Eleanor was not a crime. But his argument struggled to compete with the emotional pull of the prosecution's story. The jury, composed of ordinary townspeople, seemed swayed by sympathy for the victim and suspicion toward the quiet, nervous librarian, who now looked like a stranger in their midst. Every day of the trial deepened the divide in the community. Some believed Martin was guilty beyond question, while others whispered doubts that grew stronger as the inconsistencies piled up. The defense requested access to all the forensic reports, but several were missing, and some had been misplaced by the local police department. Even so, the judge refused a delay, stating that the case had already dragged on long enough. When Martin took the stand, his trembling voice could barely be heard as he insisted he was innocent. The courtroom remained cold and unmoved. After nearly 3 weeks, the jury retired to deliberate. It took them just 4 hours to return with a verdict. The foreman stood and declared Martin Kells guilty of murder. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval from the audience. Martin's mother, sitting in the back row, fainted as he was led away in handcuffs. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. They believed justice had been served, that Lancashire could finally rest. Martin was sentenced to life imprisonment with no chance of parole. The judge called the act a senseless crime committed by a man whose mind was poisoned by obsession. The case was closed, the press celebrated, and the police were praised for their swift work. But beneath the surface of triumph, questions lingered, small cracks in the story that no one wanted to look too closely at. Somewhere in those missing reports and ignored details lay the truth that could have saved an innocent man. Yet, as the prison gates closed behind Martin Kells, the world moved on, convinced the nightmare was over when in reality it had only just begun. 10 years passed before anyone dared to question the story that had condemned Martin Kells. By 1990, the Lancashire murder had faded from public memory, becoming little more than a cautionary tale told in legal lectures and true crime articles. Martin remained in prison, living a quiet, broken existence, refusing interviews and rarely writing letters. It might have stayed that way forever, if not for a determined journalist named Fiona March. Known for her investigations into wrongful convictions, Fiona stumbled upon Martin's case while researching a book on judicial errors in the United Kingdom. The name caught her eye, not because of the crime, but because of how little evidence supported the verdict. Something about the file didn't add up. When Fiona requested access to the court records, she found gaps everywhere. Several pieces of forensic evidence, including the cord used to bind Eleanor's wrists and the laboratory reports on the fabric sample, were missing from official storage. A few documents had handwritten notes in the margins from an officer who was never listed in the trial. Some pages had even been retyped, suggesting tampering. The deeper she looked, the more she realized that the investigation had been rushed, possibly to appease public anger. She began visiting Lancashire, meeting retired officers, old neighbors, and anyone who had known Eleanor or Martin. Many had moved away, but those who remained spoke hesitantly, their voices still weighed down by guilt and uncertainty. One discovery changed everything. In a box of old evidence photographs, Fiona found a reference to a witness statement that had never been presented in court. The document described a man in a green trench coat seen near the railway bridge on the night of the murder, a detail that was never mentioned during the trial. Martin had never owned such a coat, and no record of this witness appeared in the official transcripts. When Fiona tracked down the officer who had taken that statement, he admitted that it had been dismissed early on. The reasoning, he said, was that the description was too vague and didn't match the primary suspect. Fiona knew immediately that this was more than an oversight. It was negligent. Her next step was to revisit the financial records from the school where Eleanor worked. The supposed argument over missing charity funds had been a key part of the prosecution's motive. but the ledgers told a different story. The shortfall had been caused by a clerical error and corrected days before Eleanor's death. There was no evidence she had ever accused Martin of wrongdoing. In other words, the very motive that convicted him had never existed. Fiona's research began to attract attention. Small newspapers picked up her findings, calling for the case to be reviewed. The police department, however, refused to cooperate, claiming the evidence was too old to re-examine. Frustrated but undeterred, Fiona pressed on, convinced that the truth was buried not in what was found at the crime scene, but in what had been deliberately ignored. She began connecting the missing evidence, the withheld witness statement, and the inconsistencies in the timeline. Gradually, a darker picture emerged, one that hinted at a cover-up within the original investigation. Whether it was due to incompetence or a deliberate effort to close the case quickly, Fiona could not yet prove. But one thing was certain: Martin Kells had never been given a fair chance. His story was no longer just about a single murder in a small town. It was about a justice system that had failed, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Fiona March's investigation into the Lancashire murder took an unexpected turn when she came across a foreign police report while searching through old newspaper archives. It described a crime in the United States, a murder committed in Ohio in late 1978, just a year before Eleanor Briggs's death. The details were hauntingly familiar: a woman found near a railway track, her wrists tied with cord, signs of strangulation, and a silver button placed beside the body. Fiona felt a chill as she read it. The method was almost identical to the Lancashire killing, down to the smallest detail. She realized that either the same person was responsible for both crimes, or someone had copied the first murder deliberately. She began cross-referencing names and movements between the two countries. It was tedious work, but persistence was something Fiona had in abundance. After weeks of searching through immigration logs and archived passenger lists, she found something that made her pulse race. A man named John Havers, a British-born mechanic who had been questioned in connection with the Ohio murder but fled the country before trial, had arrived in England in October 1979, only a few weeks before Eleanor was killed. His name had never once appeared in the Lancashire police files. It was as if he had vanished upon arrival and slipped unnoticed into British life. Fiona tracked down an old American detective who had worked on the Ohio case. Through letters and late-night calls, she learned that Havers had been considered the main suspect there. His fingerprints had been found on a fragment of cord, and a witness had seen him near the crime scene the night the victim disappeared. Yet before authorities could arrest him, he boarded a cargo ship bound for the United Kingdom. By the time they caught up with his trail, he had disappeared completely. Fiona began to wonder if Eleanor's killer had crossed the ocean to escape justice and started over until fate repeated itself. The parallels between the two murders were impossible to ignore. Fiona gathered her findings into a detailed report and presented them to a London barrister specializing in wrongful convictions. He was skeptical at first, but agreed the evidence was compelling. Together they requested that the Home Office review the Lancashire case. While waiting for a response, Fiona continued her search for any trace of Havers in Britain. She discovered that a man by that same name had briefly worked at a factory just outside Lancashire under a false identity before abruptly leaving in December 1979, shortly after the murder. The possibility that the true killer had lived among the townspeople, unnoticed, was deeply unsettling. Fiona's research reached the national media, reigniting public interest in the forgotten case. Headlines asked whether the wrong man had been imprisoned for over a decade, while the real murderer walked free. Some officials dismissed the connection to Ohio as coincidence, but others quietly began to acknowledge the pattern. The similarities were too precise to ignore. As Fiona pieced together the timeline, she also uncovered a troubling silence in the police records. An unacknowledged request from American authorities to share information about Havers, dated just 2 months before Eleanor's death. For reasons never explained, the letter had been filed away and forgotten. That single act of neglect may have cost an innocent man his freedom and allowed a killer to escape twice. For Fiona, the discovery marked a turning point. The Lancashire case was no longer just about one wrongful conviction. It had become evidence of how fragmented international justice could be. She was determined to prove that the same man who murdered in Ohio had done the same in Lancashire, and that the system, through its failures and oversights, had handed him the perfect cover. Fiona March's determination reached its peak when she finally obtained access to the fingerprint archives connected to the Ohio case. It had taken months of correspondence with American officials, countless forms, and the help of a sympathetic lawyer, but when the envelope arrived at her London office, she felt the weight of years of injustice resting in her hands. Inside were photocopies of fingerprint records taken from the crime scene in Ohio in 1978. Fiona immediately arranged to compare them with the prints collected at the Lancashire murder scene. The forensic process was slow, but the results were undeniable. The two sets matched perfectly. The fingerprints belonged to John Hevers, not Martin Kells. It was the breakthrough she had been chasing for years. The evidence was overwhelming. The same man had been responsible for both murders, one in the United States and one in the United Kingdom. Fiona could barely contain her emotions as she read the final report from the forensic lab. It was the proof that could clear Martin's name beyond doubt. Yet, as she quickly learned, the legal system was not built to admit mistakes easily. When she presented the findings to the Crown Prosecution Service, she was told that under the current double jeopardy law, Martin's conviction could not be overturned simply because new evidence had surfaced. The law stated that once a person had been tried and convicted, the verdict could not be challenged even if later evidence proved their innocence. The news hit Fiona like a physical blow. She had expected resistance, but not a wall this solid. Still, she refused to accept it. She began a new campaign not just to prove Martin's innocence, but to change the very law that kept him in chains. She contacted members of Parliament, journalists, and legal experts. Some dismissed her as overly idealistic, but others saw the injustice clearly. Articles began to appear in national newspapers under headlines like "Locked Away by Mistake" and "Can Law Ignore Truth?" The story reignited the public's anger. People who had once celebrated Martin's conviction now began to question how easily justice could be twisted by outdated rules. Meanwhile, Fiona received a letter from Martin himself, written in trembling handwriting from his prison cell. It was the first time he had reached out to anyone outside his family. He thanked her for believing in him and said that even if the law never changed, he was grateful that someone finally saw the truth. The letter strengthened Fiona's resolve. She visited him soon after, and for the first time she saw the toll those years had taken. The frail frame, the pale skin, and the eyes that seemed permanently tired. Yet behind that exhaustion was a faint flicker of hope that had survived years of silence. The movement to review the case began to gather momentum. Prominent lawyers argued that justice should never be final when new facts could prove innocence. Television programs revisited the Lancashire murder, comparing it to the Ohio case in detail. Public pressure mounted until government officials were forced to address it. Committees were formed to discuss reforming the double jeopardy rule, which had been unchanged for centuries. Though the process moved slowly, the idea began to gain traction. If evidence strong enough to prove wrongful conviction appeared, the courts should have the power to reopen the case. Fiona had not only uncovered a murderer, but had sparked a debate that questioned the very foundation of British justice. Still, she knew that real change would take years, and Martin might never live to see it. Yet the truth, once buried under falsehoods and neglect, was finally breaking through, and with it came the first fragile light of redemption. Years of public pressure and relentless campaigning finally began to bear fruit. What started as one journalist's investigation had turned into a nationwide debate about the flaws in the justice system. Politicians who once ignored Fiona March's letters were now speaking her words in Parliament. Television debates and newspaper columns questioned how many other people like Martin Kells might be sitting in prison for crimes they did not commit. The old double jeopardy rule, once considered sacred, was suddenly under fire. Fiona watched the momentum build with a mixture of disbelief and determination. She had set out to clear one man's name, but now the entire foundation of criminal law was being challenged. Legal scholars argued fiercely on both sides. Some believed the existing law protected citizens from endless prosecution by the state, while others said it prevented justice when undeniable new evidence came to light. Fiona attended hearings, often sitting quietly in the back rows, taking notes as experts debated the principles she had lived and breathed for years. When she was finally called to give testimony before a committee, she spoke simply but powerfully about Martin's case, about the missing reports, the ignored witness, and the fingerprints that had been discovered across the ocean. She described the moment she learned that the law itself stood in the way of truth. Her words moved even the most skeptical listeners. The media soon named the movement the Kells Campaign, a phrase that embarrassed Martin but helped rally public sympathy. By 2003, Parliament introduced the Criminal Justice Act, which included a new provision allowing retrials in cases where compelling evidence emerged after a conviction. It was a historic change, one that reshaped how justice could be pursued in Britain. For the first time, the legal system admitted that it could correct its own mistakes. Fiona wept quietly the day the law was passed, knowing that Martin's suffering had at least forced progress that would protect others. With the new law in effect, Martin's case was immediately reviewed. The fingerprint evidence from the Ohio connection was officially submitted, along with Fiona's decade-long research. The review board concluded that the conviction had been unsafe and that Martin Kells should be retried. After 25 years behind bars, he returned to a courtroom that looked nothing like the one that had condemned him. This time the jury listened to a very different story, one that exposed the mishandling of evidence, the missing records, and the existence of another killer who had escaped justice for decades. It took only 2 days for the jury to reach a verdict. Martin Kells was declared not guilty. When the judge read the decision, the courtroom fell silent. Martin didn't smile. He simply bowed his head, his face unreadable. Outside, reporters cheered and cameras flashed. But the man they had once called the bookish killer looked too tired to celebrate. Fiona stood beside him as he stepped out into the daylight for the first time in a generation. Though he was finally free, freedom came too late to give him back what he had lost. His parents had died while he was in prison, his home was gone, and his health had deteriorated beyond repair. But his name was cleared, and his case had changed the law of an entire nation. The same system that had destroyed him had been forced to rebuild itself in his shadow. As he walked away from the courthouse, he left behind a crowd cheering his victory, but Martin knew it was not victory. It was survival, and it had cost him everything. After his release, Martin Kells disappeared quietly from the headlines that had once followed his every move. The world that greeted him outside the prison walls was unfamiliar and unkind. He had entered his cell as a young man in his 30s and emerged in his late 50s, gray-haired and fragile. The streets of Lancashire had changed, the people had moved on, and few even remembered the murder that had shattered the town a quarter of a century earlier. Martin wanted no attention, no interviews, and no sympathy. He moved to a small village in northern Scotland, far from the reporters who tried to track him down, and lived in a rented cottage near the sea. There, surrounded by quiet hills and cold winds, he tried to rebuild what little life he had left. Though he rarely spoke about his years in prison, those close to him could sense that he carried the weight of the past like a shadow that never lifted. Simple things reminded him of the world he had lost: the sound of church bells, the smell of rain on the road, the laughter of school children walking home. His hands trembled constantly, a lingering result of decades spent behind bars, and he often sat by the window for hours, staring at the water as if searching for something he could never find. Fiona March visited him occasionally, always careful not to intrude too much. To her he was not just a symbol of justice, he was a reminder of how fragile truth could be. They shared long silences more than conversations, and she often left feeling both comforted and haunted. Meanwhile, Fiona's book, The Forgotten Murder, was published soon after his exoneration. It became a bestseller across the United Kingdom and the United States. Praised for its honesty and depth, the book laid out every failure, every overlooked clue, and every moment of negligence that had condemned an innocent man. It also exposed the eerie similarities between the two murders and the way international bureaucracy had allowed a killer to slip away. The story captured public imagination, not only for its tragedy, but for the extraordinary reform it inspired. People began to see Martin not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change, a man whose suffering had forced a nation to confront its own flaws. The real murderer, John Havers, was eventually found living under a false name in South America. He was arrested after a DNA match confirmed his guilt in both the Ohio and Lancashire murders. By then, Martin was too weak to follow the news closely, but Fiona visited to tell him in person. He listened quietly, nodded once, and said nothing. That night, for the first time in years, he slept peacefully. In 2010, Martin Kells died alone in his cottage. There was no ceremony, no grand farewell, only a short notice in a local paper. His few belongings were given to charity, except for one item. Fiona kept a small framed photo of the railway bridge where Eleanor Briggs had been found. Years later, that same silver button from the crime scene was placed in the National Crime Museum, displayed beneath a plaque that read, "Evidence of Truth, Lost and Found." The world eventually forgot the details of the Lancashire murder, but its legacy endured in every courtroom where new evidence could finally speak for the silenced. The law had changed, the system had evolved, and justice had found its way through the ruins of a terrible mistake. Martin Kells never saw himself as a hero, yet his name became a quiet symbol of hope, proof that even the darkest injustices could lead to light if someone dared to search for it.